All right. Well, good to see everybody. Everybody's kind of spreading out more on me now, so as we get a rebellious bunch. It's okay. All right. So last week we didn't quite get through everything, but that's okay. We were looking at the events surrounding Peter's denial of Jesus, and where we left off, they were in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we began looking at that. So today we'll finish looking into the garden, and then we'll take a look at the arrest and the first half of the trial of Jesus according to the Gospel of Matthew. So going back to the garden here, if you turn to Matthew 26, I'm going to reread verses 36 and 46 through 46, since most of you probably don't remember that in the last week. We started there, so look at verse 36. It says, Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with them Peter and two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, So you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And he went away again a second time and prayed, saying, My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done. Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. So last week we looked at the first part of this, which was the part of what was going on with Jesus as he struggled with the flesh a little bit here, right? Not sinful flesh, but just the weakness of being a man, and talking about his desire to let this cup pass from him, but yet his spirit was completely still on course with the Lord, with the Father, I should say. And he was willing to go into this. He said, It is not as I will, but you will. And so we get to see this. We also know that Satan was directly involved with all the events surrounding this, right? We know that he had entered into Judas as he betrayed. Satan was working as well here. So one of the resources I was reading that John MacArthur put out was saying that this could be considered a second set of temptations from Satan. And we're not given the details of that in the passage, but there is certainly some sort of temptation here. And we'll look a little bit more at that as we go. But I want to look also at the response of the disciples as they go through here. So it would appear that Jesus has finished his time in prayer after the first time, but then he returns to where he left his friends. He gets up, he comes back to them, and he finds them not keeping watch as he asked, but rather they're sleeping. And so Jesus wakes them up and rebukes them, specifically by name Peter. And he says, You men could not keep watch for me for 1 hour. So there was a couple things here that struck me, a couple things to point out. Number one, well, it's late at night, right? This is after midnight, sometime between probably midnight and the 2 a.m. hour. And they had just celebrated the Passover that day. So it makes sense they'd be tired, right? It makes sense that their eyes would be heavy. We just kind of went through, been a month or so. We've gone through the holidays. If you hosted any holiday fun with your families, you were probably tired at the end of that. Similarly, they had just prepared this Passover. They just experienced that whole thing, and it was exhausting, I'm sure. So the fact that disciples are tired isn't really an issue. It's not a surprise. However, everything that had happened that evening points to some momentous events happening. If you think back to what has just taken place in the upper room, a betrayal had been predicted. There was a whole discussion around that. Jesus had specifically said he'd be betrayed into the hands of sinners. They clearly understood some part of that because they argued about who would do such a thing, and all of them claimed that it wouldn't be them. So there had to be some understanding among them that something big was about to happen. There's also the reality of how distressed Jesus was. When he took the three into the Garden of Gethsemane and told them that he was distressed even to the point of death, they had to have wondered, what would that be? What exactly is happening that he would be so distressed to this point? But yet, they're able to sleep. They fall asleep. So Jesus then, as he rebukes them and tells them to wake up, and another thing I thought about was, what exactly was he keeping watch over? Does anybody have any ideas? What he would have been told to keep watch over? That was my first question. It's like, well, was he supposed to keep watch over people coming? He knows that Judas and the betrayers are coming, and he wants them to keep watch to make sure they don't show up. I don't think so. I think it was probably more of keeping watch in a fellowship manner. Jesus was distressed. He was struggling with what was about to happen. He wanted to spend time in prayer, and he wanted his friends to fellowship with him and be with him. I think similarly, if you go through a difficult time or you end up in a hospital situation, maybe it's comforting to have people that love you alongside of you as you go through that. So Jesus asks them to be with him, and yet they fall asleep. So in verse 41, he tells them that after he wakes them up, keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation, for the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So Jesus tells them that they should stay on the alert and that they would not enter into temptation. So is he speaking about physical or spiritual alertness here? Because he's asking them to stay awake physically, but clearly he's also talking about staying alert spiritually. We just heard Jesus and Jesus' prayer, for example, that he's struggling between the flesh and the spirit, in the sense that he's saying, Lord, if this cup can pass from me, but then at the same time, his spirit is saying, your will be done. And to be clear, obviously, Jesus' flesh is not sinful. Jesus had no sin in him. We see in Hebrews 4:15, it says that, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. So the trouble in Jesus' heart is a battle between the weakness of his human flesh versus the sinless spirit within him. And he's working in maintaining the perfect unity with the Father as he marches toward the cross. So it seems that Jesus is kind of giving this is a comment of grace, I think, to the disciples. Despite his rebuke to wake up, he sympathizes with them, and he tells them to remain on the alert because he understands that the flesh is weak, and in their case, it's even sinful. So they have an even bigger disadvantage as they sit there and try to do what Jesus said. So he asked them to remain alert, awake, and on the guard, for they are human, and the flesh is weak, even when their spirit is willing. And that very night, Peter is a great example of that, right? He goes from, I will never deny you, to I never knew the man, in just a matter of a few hours. So his spirit was willing. He wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to be a man of his word and stay by Jesus, the one that he loved. But his flesh was weak, and in fear he denied Jesus. So Jesus returns and prays a similar prayer as before in verse 42, acknowledging that he knows he must drink the cup of God's wrath. So his prayer has moved a little bit from, if this cup can pass from me, to, since this cup can't pass from me, your will be done. He knows it's the Father's will. And then they do this yet again, a third time. So Jesus finds them sleeping once more, and the third prayer, and the disciples in the third failure. So at this point, Judas arrives with a cohort then of Roman soldiers and high priests, some servants of the high priest, to betray Jesus and arrest him. So as we move on to that part, I want to just ask, anybody have any comments or questions on the garden? Yeah.
Christ knew the will of God.
Yeah.
Yet he prayed,
Yeah.
he would rather have that pass by, but yet he knew God's will.
Right.
So what do you think his point was there?
I mean, I think we're seeing the Hebrews 4:15 play out, right? He knows what he's standing on the edge of. It says he was distressed unto death, and so there's a reality that for the first time in all of eternity, he's going to the fellowship between the Father and the Son are going to be put under strain because he's going to take the wrath of the Father on our behalf. And so in doing so, he's standing on the edge of a tsunami, waiting to be hit with this. And there's a fear of the Lord we just talked about in that. And so,
God demands worship from all of us.
mm-hmm,
Which fear that's part of the fear that brings us to that worship, to honor God and the worship part of it.
right,
So I'm not sure where I'm going. Christ, and back in Isaiah, where Gary brought out that he feared the Lord, Christ feared the Lord,
right,
because he wanted to worship God the Father.
yes,
So I wonder why he said that, because I don't, if the three disciples were sleeping, they didn't hear his prayer. So it just makes me wonder why he even said that.
yeah, yep, it's a good question. Good. All right, moving along to Matthew 26, verses 47 through 52. We see that Jesus has just said in 46, "Get up," to his disciples. "Let us be going." He says, "Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." So 47 through 52, while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up and accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him." Immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have come to do, or do what you have come for." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." So Judas shows up. He's leading a cohort, it says, of both Jewish, the leadership, some of the servants of them, of the household of Annas and Caiaphas, and a group of Roman soldiers. And they are there to arrest Jesus. So one of the questions I had is, why were both the Romans and the Jewish and a representation of the Jewish leadership present? The answer of that time there is that the Romans were the policing power, while the Jews had some power structure that was still allowed to take place. They had to have Roman approval to do anything, to arrest someone or do any of these types of things. So the reality was that for all involved, a revolution of any kind or any kind of rebellion or uprising would have been a really, really bad deal. The Sanhedrin didn't want it because they didn't want to disrupt what they had. And the Roman governors, Herod and Pilate, couldn't have it. Otherwise, their lives would have been at stake. And historically, this isn't in Scripture, but historically, around that time, there had already been some various uprisings. And so there's some speculation that it's possible that Pilate was already on thin ice, which could explain why he does some of the things he does in the Roman part of the trial. We'll look at that a little bit more next week. But the reality is they could not have any kind of uprising or issue that could catch the eye of Caesar or the household of Caesar, as they would get in trouble for that. So also, I was wondering, why would they bring such a large contingent with swords and clubs to arrest Jesus? It doesn't seem like that would all be necessary. So as these two groups worked together, they had to be very precise about this. Also need to remember Jesus was still popular. It had only been a week or so since he had raised Lazarus from the dead and made his triumphal entry with Lazarus alongside, and everybody knew about this. He was still popular. There was a concern there. So they come under the shroud of darkness in the middle of the night to arrest Jesus. So the other thing that I considered was Judas actually was just told by Jesus in the upper room to go do what you have to do and do it quickly, right? He also said that he knew there was a betrayer in the midst. So it would also make sense that Judas must have thought that a fight was possible. I would have to expect he would have told the Sanhedrin, they know something's afoot. Jesus said something to me, and so therefore they needed to make sure they had a large enough contingent that the disciples couldn't put up a fight or something along those lines. We don't know that for sure, but they certainly came with an entire crew of soldiers and others to make this arrest. So it makes sense also, Judas had been conspiring with them for some time, but even to the last moment when he tells them, the one whom I kiss is the one you want, he conspires with them right up until the end. Right up until the end. And then Judas betrays Jesus, acting as a friend with a kiss. Earlier in the evening, remember we talked about this last week, Judas had accepted the hospitality of Jesus. Jesus had washed his feet as he washed the feet of the 12 before the Last Supper. He had partaken in the Passover with Jesus and accepted that, and then he had actually left from that event to go betray Jesus. And that in Jewish culture was just about as bad as it gets, to accept hospitality and then to go do what Judas did. But then on top of that, he greets Jesus as a friend, and he greets him with a kiss. I believe it's the Mark account that says that he kissed him repeatedly. So he kissed him as if he was greeting him in a friendly manner. So Jesus then says two things to Judas. In Matthew 26:50, we're given a very succinct statement. He says, "Friend, do what you have come for." So Jesus calls him friend. In Luke 22:48, we're told that he said another thing to him. "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" So he asked him that question, and he made the statement, "Friend, do what you've come for." So Jesus lets Judas know essentially how terrible this deed is. This is in one sense, a heaping of condemnation, reminding him that he has been a friend, he has been one of the 12, he has been with Jesus, and then questioning the deep betrayal of marking him with a kiss. So I think on one hand, Jesus is also loving his enemy here. Judas was clearly an enemy at this point, having devised this whole thing, taken the blood money and done what he was doing, despite the friendship from earlier on. So I don't think this is a snarky, kind of sarcastic friend that he calls Judas here. He's being sincere, but that also doesn't mean that it's not intended to condemn Judas. Reminding Judas that he's been a friend and calling him out in this method of betrayal is heaping tons of condemnation on Judas. And we know how he responded to that, right? After he's arrested, Judas, we looked at this a couple weeks ago, Judas went and threw the money into the temple and killed himself. We also were told he was filled with regret. So in verse 51, we see Peter respond by drawing his sword and taking a swing at one of the servants of the chief priest. The John account tells us this guy's name was Malchus, and so we get a little more detail there. And so the first thing I thought with that is, well, Peter's off to a good start, right? He said he claimed he would never leave Jesus or betray him. And according to the John account, there was some other things that happened, but it makes you wonder, like they come to do this betrayal, he pulls his sword out and takes a swing. Well, there's a little bit more going on here. So I wondered what would embolden Peter standing in what he sees before him as Roman soldiers and a whole cohort of armed people. I wonder what he must have been thinking where he thought he could pull out a sword and take them on. And a lot of times I think we can just say, well, he was an eager guy, he was enthusiastic, that type of thing, but he was also human. Well, in the John account, in John 18:6, we see that Jesus asks them as they approach. He says, "Whom do you seek?" And they responded and said, "Jesus the Nazarene." And when he said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So they have this moment. We're not given, Matthew doesn't give us this insight. But Peter must have seen this miraculous, like he just spoke, and this entire group of people standing around him fell of spoken word. So I think that would probably indicate to Peter that, this is going to go well, you would think. Jesus just spoke. He's not going to, he probably still doesn't have the perspective that Jesus is going to go die. Even though Jesus has told him that multiple times, he still believes that Jesus is going to set up his kingdom sooner than later, and he's on the winning side. And by Jesus speaking and knocking all these guys back and falling to the ground, he must have thought this is where it starts. And so Peter does this brash thing where he cuts off the guard's ear. So the Gospel of Matthew gives us the most complete response then from Jesus to Peter in all the Gospels on this rash decision. So Jesus says a couple of things here. First, he tells Peter to put his sword back in his sheath. Put your sword away. And according to the Luke 22 account, Jesus also heals the ear of Malchus in a miraculous way. Now, if you put yourself in the shoes of these guards, wouldn't you start thinking a little bit? He just knocked us all down with a word. He just miraculously healed a guy's ear. But they were on a mission, and they were not going to be dissuaded from what they were there to do, and that was to arrest Jesus. So Jesus then gives a statement letting the betrayer, the disciples, the captors, and all that were there playing out understand that this was the will of God. So he gives a proverb to Peter. He says, "Those who take the sword will perish by the sword." So just to make this clear, this is not an absolute command that the sword is never necessary. This is a passage that frequently is used by pacifists and different people who would always be against any type of violence, whether that be on a corporal side or not. That's not what Jesus was saying here. But in this case, we know from Luke 22:49 that Peter actually had asked Jesus if he should strike with the sword. But then he didn't bother to wait for an answer. So he acted in a rash, violent way, and he took a swing. So his action was rash, and it was sinful in the sense that he did not have the Lord's blessing to do that. So he says, by using your sword, you will bring upon yourself retribution. There is no good result that can come from it in this situation. Second, Jesus tells him that it's unnecessary to use his sword. So if you look at verse 53, Jesus then goes on, and he says, "So do you, or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" So he tells Peter, your fight is unnecessary. At any point, I can stop this. The Father will put at my disposal angels, and everybody would be destroyed that would be coming up against him. But ultimately, in verse 54, Jesus tells Peter the main reason, that the will of the Father will be done. He says in 54, "How then will the scriptures be fulfilled which say that it must happen this way?" And at that time, Jesus said to the crowds, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all of this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets. Then all the disciples left him and fled. So Jesus ultimately tells these people, everyone who's listening, this is all unfolding exactly to plan. This is all happening according to the will of the Father, according to the prophecy of the Old Testament. This is all happening just like it's supposed to go. He is still completely in control. So in verses 55 and 56, he tells Peter why he shouldn't use a sword, but then he tells the captors the same thing. And he points out to them that he sat in open daylight in the temple and taught. They could have seized him at any point, but they didn't. Here they are now under the shroud of darkness trying to do this. And he tells them the reason they're there is because it was the will of God and it was to fulfill the scripture. So all of this is going exactly to plan. Then the disciples fled. But the Luke account tells us actually that Jesus asked for them to be able to leave. So again, fulfilling prophecy. So all of the disciples scatter, as the scripture said they would. And except for Peter. Peter keeps a distance, and he ends up following Jesus after his arrest back to the high priest's palace. So Jesus was 100% in lockstep with the Father's will, and nothing that was going to take place was out of the will of God or even out of the understanding of Jesus. He knew what was happening, and he's walking faithfully toward the cross. So Peter obviously didn't know this plan. He wasn't privy to the same understanding. So this must have been very confusing to him. And I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt a little bit here because what took place for him the rest of the evening was awful. And we went through that and saw that last week. But at this point, Jesus is bound, and they take him back to the house or the palace of the high priest. So this is the place where Annas and Caiaphas resided. Annas was the old chief priest. Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas, who is the current chief priest, and they live in the same compound. The family business had been good to them. They were corrupt and had used the priesthood for their own gain, and they had this place that they lived. So the trial of Jesus, as they go back to that compound, it begins, and there are two there are two acts to the trial of Jesus, with three parts to each act. So the first part was we'll call it the Jewish act. And there is first a pre-trial, you could call it, with Annas. Then there was a follow-up with Caiaphas and the elders, and then they had to have another kind of sham of a trial for the public with the same people the next morning. So we'll look at those. And then the Roman side, you see him go to Pilate, then he goes to Herod, and then back to Pilate. So each of these are kind of different scenes with different purposes, all leading to the same place. So as we get into this, the whole thing is a wicked farce. They were at every point violating their own laws in order to carry out this murder conspiracy. There was almost nothing legitimate about any part of this trial. For example, just so we understand a little bit, I'm not going to go through all of the laws that they violated, but I do want to highlight four of them. One of them was Jewish law said that no trial that would decide a potential death penalty could be conducted at night. We're starting off in the middle of the night. An arrest could not be made as a result of bribery or blood money, and yet they had just done that as well. A defendant could not be asked to incriminate himself. So they had to bring witnesses. They couldn't directly ask questions of someone who was standing trial to be put to death, and yet they did that throughout the whole thing to Jesus. And finally, in capital punishment cases, a decision rendered for death could not be announced for at least one full day after the decision was announced. So a sentencing could not take place until at least a day after a verdict was rendered. So that is just four of more than a dozen ways that this trial was illegal from the beginning. So let's look first at the Jewish part of this trial. We won't get to the Roman part today. We'll do that next week. So if you turn with me to the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Matthew, which we'll look at here in verse 20, in chapter 26, does not deal at all with the pre-trial, the trial with Annas. It skips right to the trial with Caiaphas. So I want to go to the Gospel of John and look quickly at what happens with Annas. And we're going to look at John 18. And we're going to be verse 13 first, and then 19 through 24. Actually, I'm going to start with 12. So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. And then skipping down to 19 through 24, we get to see what that trial, how that went. It says, the high priest then questioned. The high priest here is Annas. They're calling him the high priest. By the way, that's he wasn't the acting high priest, but it's kind of similar to, for us as a president, once you're the president, even if you're a former president, you're still called president, whatever. So he was still holding that title, even though Caiaphas was the actual high priest at that time. All right, so the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I've spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. And when he had said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, Is that the way you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken wrongly, testify the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So that's what took place. It was a pretty brief conversation, according to what we're given here. So Annas, it's interesting. The first question he asks wasn't about what he taught, right? It was about his followers. He wanted to know about the disciples of Jesus. And that makes sense, because if you think about what Annas was all about as the high priest, it was power. What kind of influence do you have? What kind of revolution have you begun? Because what happened just a few days prior, right? Jesus went in there and he cleared the temple. And Annas' business was disrupted. And he's mad about all this. That was his primary concern, was what kind of actual influence and power do you have? And so he asks this question, not about the nature of what he taught, but what type of following do you have? And Jesus responds, and he said, I never did teach in secret. I didn't organize a revolution. I taught in the synagogues. I taught in the temple. I taught in the open. Go ask what I taught. He wasn't interested in what he taught. He was interested in what was happening to disrupt the power structure. But Jesus answers according to what really matters. He answers according to the teaching. Go ask them what I taught. And I have spoken the truth. And he basically is putting this back on Annas. Can you refute what I'm saying? So why did Jesus tell Annas to get the info about his teaching from those who heard his teaching? This is actually really smart, because Jesus is exposing the farce that this was. Because he was under trial. He knew he was under trial to be killed, and yet he is being personally questioned without witnesses. And so he exposes Annas and his effort here to condemn Jesus when he's not supposed to be questioned in this way. He says, if you have any accusations to make, shouldn't you have witnesses? That's what Jesus is putting back on him. So the officer standing alongside doesn't like this, and he hits Jesus and tells him not to speak to the priest this way. A couple things kind of jumped out at me here. Number one, who is the real high priest? Right? Jesus is. And yet here he is being hit by an underling nobody guard for being disrespectful, as in his view, of this sinful, despicable high priest. Also, it's interesting, he wasn't ordered to strike Jesus. The high priest didn't say, take care of my light work or something like that. He just responded. He seems like an overeager underling who's trying to make a name for himself or something, and he hits Jesus and goes down and really sets himself up this way as someone who's over Jesus. The humiliation of this is hard to comprehend. Jesus is standing trial before a wicked priest and his nasty underling. Meanwhile, Peter is outside denying Jesus at the same time. The suffering is significant. So Jesus corrects the officer, saying that he's innocent. And of course, Annas knows it, so he sends him away. He sends him back to Caiaphas. Annas was unable to get what he wanted out of this conversation, and he knows he has nothing. So he sends him back to Caiaphas, which was somewhere else in this compound. So by now, Caiaphas would have been able to gather the members of the Sanhedrin that he could have gathered for this second trial. So this first scene with Annas does not appear in the Matthew account at all. The second scene with Caiaphas does. So go back to Matthew, and we're going to look at verses 57 through 68 of chapter 26. And it says this. It says, those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though the many false witnesses came forward. But later on, two came forward and said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" The high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his robes and he said, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have for witnesses? Behold, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they answered, "He deserves death." They spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who was the one who hit you?" So, while Jesus is being questioned by Annas, Caiaphas is gathering everybody together. We also see that they have gathered together false witnesses to bring accusations against Jesus in verse 60. So in the prior verse, it says that they were doing whatever they could to obtain what they needed. They were trying to obtain false testimony that they could claim as true so that they could put Jesus to death. Remember, they've been conspiring against Jesus since Matthew 12, back months ago. So this is not a true trial. This is a murder conspiracy that they have been planning and moving toward this whole time. So they were probably working on finding these testimonies. It wasn't like they just did it in the last half hour, Once Jesus was arrested, we got to get him together. They've been working on finding people that would testify or bear false witness against Jesus this whole time. But they were unable to get what they were looking for. So what's interesting about this is how much of a sham this is. So witnesses in capital punishment cases in the Jewish system had a huge burden of responsibility on their shoulders. The oath that they took put them on the hook so that if they lied or if they were wrong, they themselves could be killed. And there was also all kinds of regulations, including from the time you were asked to bear witness to the time that you do give that testimony. There had to be at least a full day between that agreement so you could consider the seriousness of being a witness in a capital punishment case. But not on this night. They brought in all kinds of people. Who knows if they even had them take the oath. It's kind of similar to our oath, right? We put our hand, if you ever are a witness in a court case, you have to take an oath saying that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. It's kind of a similar type thing, except for they took it a step further. And we have perjury in our system, but their perjury led to some more significant consequences than ours, including up to death. But they just brought people in to make accusations, see what held up. They didn't follow any of their own justice system laws to bring this about. And so they're bringing these people in. So the other question I had, well, why did the Sanhedrin need this trial? Why did they need to obtain a witness? There's two reasons. They needed something to present to the Jewish people. Jesus was still popular. They still were looking into the possibility that maybe he was the Messiah or he was at least a prophet. They're trying to figure out what he did. They know that he was someone they were following to some degree, whether it be for the right reason or not. And they have to give a good reason to the Jews, to the people, a justification, so to speak, for why they want to execute Jesus. They also needed an actual cause to present Pilate and the Romans, because they weren't going to just kill someone just because the Jews wanted them to. They had to actually have a justification, legal justification for them as well. So they're unable to obtain this, and so in verse 61, they finally found their break, sort of. One guy states, or two guys it says, that Jesus claimed to be able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Is that what Jesus said? Anybody know? So the thing that they say that's incorrect here is that Jesus never said he would destroy the temple, right? They're claiming that he said he would destroy the temple. Jesus said if the temple were destroyed, right, he would rebuild it in 3 days, talking about himself, of course. So they twisted what he said, and what they're claiming here basically is that Jesus was a defamer of the temple. That's what this testimony is supposedly pushing toward. That's what they were understanding. Jesus is a defamer of the temple. So Caiaphas raises up against Jesus. He stands up and asks him if this testimony is true, but Jesus doesn't say anything because it's a ridiculous claim. He's not even going to dignify it with a response. He easily could have refuted this and ended it, but Jesus knows this is not a fair trial. This is a sham, and they're going to keep going for whatever they can get. So he says nothing. He's also allowing for the fulfillment of prophecy as he moves toward the cross. So in verse 63, Caiaphas kind of puts Jesus in the corner, to use a boxing term. He says the words, "I adjure you by the living God." So this is essentially putting Jesus under oath. And he demands an answer for the question if Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. And Jesus answers him immediately this time. He doesn't remain silent. He's not wondering if he should say this or not. He says to him, "You have said it," which is the same thing as saying, "Yes, indeed." Absolutely. He answers with a strong affirmative. And then he adds to it that after they do what they're going to do, you're going to see me, Jesus says, at the right hand of the Father sitting in judgment. So this is the first time Jesus has directly made this claim to these guys. He's made the claim to be the Messiah at other points, to the disciples, to the lady in Samaria, the woman. He has done this several times. He actually kind of alluded to it at the end of the triumphal entry when the kids are singing praises to him, and he allows it. But this is the first time that he says directly, "Yes, I am the Messiah." And then he adds to it that he's going to stand in judgment over them after they do what he does. A huge statement. And this is all Caiaphas needs. In verse 65, Caiaphas tears his clothes in a show of fake sorrow. He's, I'm sure, happy as can be that he got what he wanted. And he proclaims Jesus' crime, which is blasphemy. Of course, it should be noted, obviously, that Jesus was in fact not blaspheming, right? He was, the verdict was incorrect. Jesus truly was the Messiah, and so it was Caiaphas that was sinning here yet again. But the high priest then asks for the other elders what they think, and he proclaims that they have no need for anything else, no witnesses. We have all we need. Guilty of blasphemy in their eyes, and the entire board of the Sanhedrin unanimously agrees according to the Gospel of Mark. So they have a verdict, but they cannot unilaterally give a sentence. So there's no sentence given. They did say that he's deserving of death, but the Sanhedrin is unable to carry that through as a sentence. The Romans are necessary for that. But remember, we're still in the middle of the night here. We're still in the middle of the night. So they still have the issue of the Jewish public and what they may think. And so at this point, they're going to recommend a death sentence, but they need to move that to the Romans. So what they do at this point is they just humiliate Jesus. They spit in his face, they beat him, they mock him, and they do this for however long it took. But ultimately, they needed to have another sham hearing for part of this trial that would show publicly what was happening. So a few hours pass, maybe 2 or 3, 4, I don't know, however long it takes for daylight to come, and they could go back to the temple, and they could convene there, no longer in the house of the high priest under the shroud of darkness, and they call the Sanhedrin back together. And we see in just 2 quick verses in Matthew 27, it says, "Now when morning came," verses 1 and 2, "Now when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate, the governor." So they get together one last time. They make the accusations. They claim blasphemy against him. They recommend death, and they're going to take him now to Pilate. So the third scene of the first act is just a public display, essentially. to show the Jewish people that this is what's happened overnight, and this is what they're intending to do. So next week, we are going to get into the Roman part of it. So we'll look at what took place between Pilate and Herod. So I went like 3 minutes over, so you guys are dismissed. Especially if you have kids down in the nursery.